The army didn't want anyone near the airport. The crowds came anyway. They didn't go near the fence. The soldiers barking orders made sure of that. But they still milled nearby, close enough to gawk at and snap pictures of the gleaming alien silver parked on the runway. The train of buses carrying Max and his unlucky fellows parted the throngs of onlookers, which quickly swelled again to cover up the service road behind them. Though most eyes focused on the spaceship parked on the runway ahead, Max found his and another pair in the crowd meeting for a passing glance. Her brown irises looked just like Jess's. They were weeping, the whites turned a watery red, and the lids swollen with sorrow. He swallowed back his own tears. He turned and squinted hard at his destination. The landing ship looked too graceful for something built by genocidal aliens. It had long, flowing curves that even without wings made it look like it was streaking through the skies at 1,000 miles an hour, just sitting on the tarmac. Max had no reason to doubt its airworthiness. Its towering height, silhouetted by the sunset, made the buses look like Hot Wheels. The soldiers ordered them all off, one row at a time. They explained that some had tried to escape at such moments before, ducking toward the hangars or dashing for the fence, so everyone was bound together by a line of paracord knotted around their ankles. Once they had stumbled down the steps, the sullen line shuffled awkwardly toward the behemoth. The breeze carried a few angry shouts from the crowd beyond the fence. Quite a few of them had started waving signs. They weren't too pleased with the draft. Neither were the soldiers, who had the kind of stony looks on their faces that said they were just barely tolerating this farce. Max secretly hoped that, like some movie, a lone one would drop his weapon and stand defiant, unwilling to follow such dreadful orders. Then the others, one by one, would find their conscience by his example and drop theirs too. The captives would be freed, and the Lawtons would retreat from Earth, their sinister plot frustrated. But this was no movie. It was September, and the mid-Atlantic air was still choking hot. He hated them, but each sweaty breath would soon become his last on Earth. Up an air stair, they climbed into the dark hatch. The people in front of him dragged him by his ankles into the unknown. He only discovered what was inside once he had already crossed the threshold and seen his last sunset. The inside here was cylindrical, with a few ladders running up the towering interior that must have been 100 feet tall at least. Between them, with feet bolted to the wall and heads pointed inward, stood long columns of seats. Unseen lights bathed seats and people in a pale green. A few eyes far above his were peering out from their headrests to look down at him. They were other draftees, not the aliens he'd been hoping to spit on. A quick look at the remaining empty seats and the lines he had seen outside meant his convoy of buses was likely the last before launch. The soldiers untied his ankles here since the restraints were too cumbersome for climbing ladders. They directed him up 3 rows and to a seat on the far side from the hatch. He strapped himself in, his back to the ground, his feet on the wall, his head swiveling constantly to watch the rest of the draft file below. Eventually, the last ankles were unbound, the last seat filled by a girl who looked barely out of high school, and the hatch hissed shut behind the departing soldiers.
Hey.
His seatmate on his right tapped his shoulder. It was a guy who looked a bit older than him, maybe in his mid-20s.
Any idea when we'll go?
Quiet murmurs like this one floated around the silo full of people. There were no cameras or windows or any kind of display to the outside. Of course, they would probably feel when the engines kicked in and they blasted off, but who really knew? Maybe the aliens had some kind of technology that made acceleration imperceptible. Maybe they were already in space. Either way, the Lawtons weren't giving them a countdown. Max turned back to his seatmate. He was about to say, "No idea," but a jolt of acceleration threw his throat into his stomach. They lurched deep into the padding of their seats, the whole ship shaking and bucking and thundering like a hurricane.
Guess now!
He replied with chattering teeth, barely hearing his own voice over the dull roar of thrust below them. The seats looked hastily made when he first saw them. Now they felt like it. At any moment he feared his would come right off the wall and fling him into the crowd below. The metal at his feet started to groan. His eyes widened with alarm, but his vision was shrinking. He blinked. All was calm. They were no longer moving. He looked at his feet, and they were still planted on the wall. So was his seat, thankfully. Something odd caught his eye. The straps that had been pressing on his chest like an elephant were now suspended in the air, as if they weighed nothing at all.
You're finally awake.
His seatmate chuckled.
I saw you pass out like we were on a roller coaster.
It really felt like we were.
Max said, a little embarrassed over his loss of consciousness.
I think we're in space now. Look at that.
His seatmate pointed ahead of them. Someone had unbuckled himself and was now floating around in the empty center of their compartment, using the headrest to propel himself and spin around. People cheered and whistled as he flew by, high-fiving them as he went. Max laughed. It felt refreshing, like a taste of something he hadn't had in a long time. They watched the man pirouette around in zero-G, tuck himself into a ball like he was making a cannonball jump into a pool, then unfurl himself again. Unfortunately, when he did so, he finally lost his sense of balance and the contents of his stomach. He threw up a cloud of bile-colored droplets that quickly drifted over his spectators. Everyone winced and groaned. The girl closest to the acrobat screamed as she was pelted with his half-digested dinner. Those around her struggled to unbuckle themselves and fly out of the path of the oncoming debris. Some caught a whiff of the scene and threw up themselves. Max gagged once the smell hit him far behind them, but he managed to hold on to his beer. He and his seatmate laughed again, albeit a little more sardonically. Someone with a crop of blonde hair finally cleaned the mess up by volunteering his t-shirt and a few borrowed jackets. Soon after, another jolt yanked their heads forward and sent the unbuckled into the laps and faces of the rest. A solid thump echoed across the hull. Fortunately for the acrobat, the vomit had quickly been forgotten about, even if it still gave the air a bad stench. Everyone was now busy asking in hushed voices if they had reached the alien fleet. The hatch opened and a bright white light rushed in from beyond. Looking directly upwards in his seat, Max could see a bit down the corridor the hatch now opened to. But he was more interested in what occupied it, a creature that resembled nothing less than a child-sized macaw, complete with tropical plumage and a metallic ring around its left leg. The bird squawked at them. A digital voice, far more imposing than its owner, boomed from the ring on its leg.
Out!
The human stared blankly at it, Max included. All his vicarious fury on Richie's behalf had dissipated, replaced by astonishment. This gentle-looking bird was one of those monsters that had wiped out the Koreans. This was one of the aliens that had tried to take his little brother. Those who couldn't see the bird from their end of the ship asked, "What was that?" Everyone below was too stunned to reply. The bird carried something under the curl of its right wing, a long rod that resembled some kind of baton. It peered at the humans with a beady little eye that made it look crotchety, if anything. Max couldn't tell it actually was angry until it struck the girl closest to the hatch with the baton. A coil of electricity lashed out at her from the end of the baton, and she yelped in pain. A havoc of outraged voices descended on the bird. The humans were getting out of their seats, but not to obey its order. They charged toward the fleeing bird, shouting at it as it fled into the corridor. There, some interlocked their arms and blocked any access through the hatch. Behind them, a few attended to the girl with soothing voices. She was rubbing her arm, but otherwise looked okay to Max. The bird disappeared behind another hatch at the end of the corridor, eyes clearly wide with fright.
That'll show 'em,
a stranger muttered to the muted approval of the mob. But a few moments later, everyone started to hear something hissing. It was coming from the corridor.
Gas! They're going to gas us!
Someone cried. Everyone panicked, scrambling over each other for a non-existent exit. At the bottom, the stone wall of people protecting the hatch had suddenly fallen limp. Max unbuckled himself and climbed upwards, deeper into the ship and away, presumably, from the invisible gas. Against the bulkhead, he and a handful of others huddled close together, watching it creep closer with each person who suddenly fell unconscious. He looked to his left. His seatmate was floating away, holding the pose of a man petrified. He looked to his right. A woman's last lucid act was a terrified glance at him before her eyelids dropped like lead. Max held his breath as long as he could, but for the second time today, he blinked.